Hi there. Mother's Day is coming up, and you know what that means, coming up with something for mom. And that's always a struggle for people. You know, what do you get for mom? Well, it usually ends up being flowers or candy. But you know, if you want to do something special for mom, make her something. And so I've decided to make a little recipe box. It's not that hard a project to do, but let me tell you this, precision is key. And so you want to take the time to make sure you measure things accurately and you set up your saws accurately so you get good, accurate cuts. The truly challenging part of cutting a box, a mitered box, is setting up your table saw. I don't do a lot of these, so I'm very cautious when I do them, okay? There's a couple of things that are very critical to us here. Number one is the blade angle, and the number two is that our miter gauge is absolutely perpendicular to the blade. So let me show you what I've done to do that. First, I used a digital level for setting my saw angle, okay? And I started off by zeroing it to the table. Then I attached it to the blade, swung the blade over, and measured it. Now, you can also do this with a digital protractor, like this, setting this to 0. Okay, I'm zeroing it with it closed. And then I can measure from the table to the blade. And rather than getting 45 degrees here, what I'm actually getting is 135 degrees. Why? Because I've got the 90 degrees plus the 45, okay? I also use a digital protractor, although a larger one, to set up my miter gauge, make sure it's perpendicular to the blade. But in reality, what I'm doing is making sure it's perpendicular to the fence. And I set it for exactly 90 degrees, set it to my fence, and then I adjusted my miter to the gauge, okay? That's the only way you can know for sure that you're going to be absolutely right. You can't count on this gauge, you can't count on the gauge on the front of your saw. They're just not accurate enough. And if this isn't absolutely perfect, you're going to end up with gaps in your miters. The other thing that's critical here is the length of cut. And when I'm referring to that, I'm not talking about comparing the length of the cut to the drawing, because if it's a little off, you can adjust your other parts and make that work it out. What's critical here is that opposite sides have the exact same length, because if not, your miters aren't going to meet up. So what I'm setting up here is that, and I've taken a scrap piece and I've already miter cut one end, okay? Now I can set it in here, and I've attached a block to my fence, basically to use it as an auxiliary fence. And the reason I want to do that is you don't want to be running this piece up all the way up the fence with the miter, because there's a good chance of binding and kickback. So to avoid that, I'm just using this little block as an auxiliary fence as a gauge for how far over I'm going to set my piece, and I'll bring my fence up to that point, my sacrificial fence or my auxiliary fence up to that point, and lock down my fence there. Now, even if that's off what the drawing is, it's my dimension, okay? Just as long as it's big enough. So now I can run this through and cut this side, and then I can flip the board over and cut the other side, and they'll be exactly the same length. And that's what's important. And then I'll redo my setup, essentially the same thing, but for the opposite sides because they're shorter. I made a mistake here in cutting my longer pieces before my shorter pieces. The reason that's a mistake is that I've now reached a point where the piece that I'm cutting from isn't all that big, and holding this while running that through isn't going to be real safe, okay? So what do? Well, here's my solution. This is that piece I said I was using for testing before, okay? And I'm going to attach it to that and allow that to give me some more length. So now I can clamp this part to my fence, making a much safer cut. Part of the box's design requires I put a rabbet in the top and bottom of each of the sides on the inside, and that's so that the lid and the bottom can inset into there. I want to try and hide the end grain as much as possible, and that's part of the way I'm doing it, along with mitering my corners. Okay, so I'm ready to assemble the sides of my box together, and the easiest way to do that is with a little bit of painter's tape to help line the pieces up, longer than the sum of all of my sides is, okay? And then I'm going to line up the pieces on this tape, and I want to make sure that my ends, my edges, get exactly touching. Okay. box. Now we can apply a little glue, and if I did everything right, I should be able to just fold this up, and I didn't. This piece is upside down. Okay, let's try again. So I can fold this up. I'm going to tear the excess tape off of this. I'll do one other thing here to help make sure I've got everything aligned properly, and that's to drop in the bottom, even though actually this is the top side. But that's all right. It works the same. Now I know everything's clean, and I'm going to go ahead and clamp it. Now, a lot of people wouldn't bother clamping this at this point. You can get by without clamping it as long as you've got all your seams really snug. I just like to clamp it as extra precaution. I'm not going to use a huge amount of force here. We're not talking about a structural item. We're talking about a little box. Granted, it's oak. It could handle whatever amount of pressure I put on, but I don't need a lot of pressure. So there we go. Now we'll leave that to dry, and then we'll go ahead after that. We'll glue in the top and the bottom, and then we'll cut the box in half so we have a top and a bottom. Because right now it's going to end up being a cube. Well, not quite a cube, but a solid rectangle. And I'll need to be able to open it up some point in time. So, but it's easier to make the box align perfectly if you make it as one box and then cut it than it is to make two separate pieces and try and get them made up. Okay, the size of our box came out really nicely with nice tight miters all the way around. Now remember, I routed the top and bottom of this to inset the top and the bottom to the box, and that's because I'm trying to avoid having any end grain showing. So the bottom is actually routed a little deeper than the top. The top is routed so that this should sit flush. Might take a little sanding, and then the bottom is actually inset about 1/8 of an inch. And I did that just so there isn't as much surface sitting on the bottom. And in case I would have a problem with it being flat or being even, there'd be less I'd have to sand. Okay, well, it turns out it's flat and even, but I was planning ahead. So we can go ahead and glue these parts in. This is one place where we really don't actually need to get carried away with the amount of glue we use. There's not going to be a lot of strain on these parts. And because this is oak and being open grain, if we get a lot of squeeze out, it may end up causing a problem for us with getting our finish to turn out. Now this part is really snug. I just barely don't need to use a hammer or a mallet to get it in. Okay, now the bottom isn't as snug. And then I'm going to put a couple clamps on here and let this dry. Now, there's no sense putting a huge amount of clamping pressure on here because really, this is not like edge gluing panels, okay? The main reason I'm clamping it is just to keep things from falling apart. There we go. So we'll let that sit and let the glue dry. One of the challenging things about making any box is making the lid and the bottom part of the box line up. And there's a really easy solution to that. And that's just that you make the box as a whole, and then you cut it apart. That's a whole lot easier than trying to make a top section and bottom section and make sure they come out right. So I've got my box all put together, and I'm bringing it over to the table saw here. And I'm not going to cut a whole lot off the top here. I'm only going to go for about 1 inch. And I'm bringing my saw blade up high enough that I can make it in 2 passes. Instead of having to go all 4 sides, I'll just go the 2 long sides. So let's go ahead and cut this. I think all I need is a little hardware and it'll be done. We're just about done with the box now. We need to put a little hardware on it. And because this is oak, I'm going to end up having to pre-drill the holes. Pi and I could probably just drive the screws right in. Decided to make this out of oak, so we got to deal with that. And this is really small hardware with really small screws. So not only do we have the hinges on the back side, but we're going to put a latch on the front side. That isn't an absolute requirement. You can buy these. These are really easily to find, really easy to find. I bought this as a set. It had 2 complete sets of the parts, and they just screw in. Easy to work with. And here's our finished box. Still need to do a little more varnishing. I haven't varnished the inside, and I really want to get a couple more coats on the outside here. I just did 1 coat so far, and I was just trying to get the grain to come out. I love how oak looks once it's varnished. It just really brings the grain out. So this is a great little project. It was really rather easy to do. The real key to the whole thing is cutting those miters. If you can cut those miters right, you can have a very nice little box. And don't worry about the laser engraving. If you don't have a laser engraving, there's a lot of ways you can decorate the top of that box. And just leave it plain. You don't even need to do that. Nice gift, and it makes it even nicer in that it's something you've made yourself. So, time to go make some sawdust, huh?